welcome everybody out there. Wherever you are, I hope you're toasty and warm. Hopefully even have a nice little fire crackling in the background. But my name is Stefan. I'm with the Finland Food Chain, which is a project of the Friends of Finland community up here in Finland, Minnesota. And today we are here to talk about pruning. And as Cindy Hale just said, it is pruning season. Though you don't have to do it when it's sub-zero. You can wait for a slightly warmer day. Let's see. So the Finland Food Chain, if you're not aware of us yet, we're up here in the Finland area, and we work on developing a local food system up in the Finland area, working with our regional partners in the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. And today, this is an ongoing webinar series that we have. You can see this and many of our other webinars we've done over the year at finlandfoodchain.org. And here we have Cindy Hale.
All right. Can everybody see my first slide there? Pruning pome fruit. What the heck are pome fruit? Well, they're basically apples and pears. So lots of people wanted lots of stuff, but we only have an hour. So we're really going to be focused, uber focused on an introduction to central leader pruning for training young trees, maintenance pruning, and then some restorative tips if you're wanting to restore either a young tree that hasn't been maintained or an older tree that you want to bring back into production. There's a lot of things we're not going to be able to cover, but if you want to hear those in a future ZOOMinar, put it in the chat box and we'll add it to the list. So just like Stefan said, we're recording this presentation. The presentation in its entirety, as well as the slideshow, will be downloadable from at the Finland Food Chain. It usually takes us about a week to get that up. And I'm going to go fast through the slides. But if you have a particular question as we're going, type it into the chat or the Q&A box, and David and Stefan are going to be monitoring those and stopping me periodically as I need to, so we can try to get to as many questions as you can. So pome fruit, just for those botanically oriented folk, are things that have cores like apples and pears. And in general, pome fruits do well with a central leader pruning style. Their size, however, is determined by rootstock, and you'll find out more about that as we go through. Stone fruits like cherries and plums, they have a pit, right? So they're different, and many of those you may or may not want to use central leader. So dealing with pruning and training of cherries and plums is a slightly different animal as well. There are lots and lots and lots of online resources for pruning. There's tons of YouTube videos, but these two are in particular two that I really like that you can find online for free. They're short. They're very kind of to the point with the most pertinent things. You can easily buy a 50-page book that gives you all the minutia, and then you finish reading it and you have no idea what to do. So sometimes it's better to just go with a simple guide, start doing it, and learn as you go. And again, all this stuff is going to be on the slides that you can download, so you don't have to be scribbling these down. So I got a couple of questions. People wanting to do espalier, which is super fun. Totally different animal. You really are dealing with very different principles and strategies when you're trying to espalier a tree. But because we have a new Finland community garden, I think it would be awesome to put in some espalier apple trees, maybe some pear trees, and then turn that into a workshop, document it. So the first question a lot of people ask is, why do we have to prune in the winter? It's so cold and icky. Why can't we do it in the summer? And the answer very shortly is that the tree needs to be in a fully dormant state when you remove live tissue. And the reason for that is that when the tree is in fully active growth, there's a lot of hormones going on. And we all know you don't want to mess with hormones because they are powerful things. You can remove dead wood anytime, and in fact, it's good to remove dead wood anytime. But in general, you don't want to remove living tissue during the growing season because you're messing with that hormone balance in the tree. Auxin is a hormone that is produced by the very uppermost buds in a tree, the terminal buds, whether they're outer buds or upper buds, and that central leader, that tallest branch that going right straight up, they produce auxins, and auxins suppress the sprouting of buds, which is a good thing because we're trying to grow fruit, really not wood. But the cytokines are a hormone that's produced by the roots. The cytokines are saying they're important, especially when you plant a new tree, because you do want some wood to grow then. So it's saying, buds, go, grow, be free, unbridle yourselves. And the auxins are saying, whoa, slow down, slow down. And so what we're doing when we're pruning is we're messing with that balance a little bit. So why we prune in the winter is because we're trying to minimize how much we mess with that balance. This is also why you cannot make a large tree small by cutting off the top. I'm really sorry that people who want to know how to make a big tree small, the answer is you can't. You can't. The tree is genetically predisposed to be the size it is. There's a little bit of variability based on climate and soil and things like that. But basically a fully standard tree is going to be a 30, 40 foot tree. And you can whack the top off all day long and it's still going to grow back and look like that. That tree is a mess. Somebody took off, I don't know if it was a bear or somebody cut off that central leader. And as a result, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of water sprouts. And it would take years to get that tree back into hormonal control. So again, I apologize, but the reality is you can't make a big tree small. If you're planting new, this is why you want to be aware of what rootstock you're growing, because the rootstock determines the size of the tree. If you want a small tree, get a semi-dwarf or a dwarf rootstock. If you want an espalier, you might get a high density super dwarf stock. So there you go. Pruning tools. The good thing about pruning is you don't need a lot of really expensive tools. You don't need a cherry picker. If you have one, that'd be great. But, so you need a bypass pruners, some saws, some loppers, extension poles, which are nice if you have a big tree that you're trying to manage, and limb spreaders, especially if you're training a young tree. Snowshoes, and notice that one thing not on the list is a chainsaw. And I'll explain a little more why no chainsaw. So the bypass pruners or hand pruners are called that because the cutting edge, this little guy right here, that cutting edge literally goes past the anvil. Unlike the one in the lower corner with the orange handle, that anvil is flat and the cutting blade comes down to it in a T. Anvil pruners are developed and made for cutting green growth. Bypass pruners are really designed for woody growth. So a bypass pruner isn't that good for cutting green stuff. Similarly, the anvil pruner is not that great for cutting woody stuff. So get the tool that's designed to do what you want to do, and you will have more success. So there are lots of different kinds of bypass pruners to choose from. And keep in mind that typically a hand pruning bypass pruner, you're going to be cutting a twig under 3/4 of an inch. So depending on how big your thumb is, maybe your finger size. And of all of these tools, most of them are pretty crappy. So a lot of these they're assembled of plastic and other weak parts. So for example, this one here right under the word crappy with the black handle, it's got a metal blades, but then this silver part that looks like it's metal, it's actually plastic. It's all held together by weird little pieces, and so all these bolts and levers and stuff. And this little blue one with the small cutting edge, it's just really small, a weak cutting edge. You can't cut more than about 1/4 inch with that. So it's important to know, again, know what you want to do with a pruner, and then spend a little bit extra money and get a good tool. So the ones that I like are these ones with the red handle. They're basically a solid metal body and blade. They're 2 pieces. They're held together by a nice bolt. They have a heavy duty spring, so when it'll open on its own, and then it's got a nice little lever to close it when you're done using it. Again, the other nice thing about these is because it's a nice heavy metal, you can sharpen them. And a sharpened tool is always a better tool. A lot of these other ones that have biparts or plastic, you really can't sharpen them. And so they end up not being worth much after 1 or 2 seasons. Another thing to be aware of if you haven't bought a bypass pruner and you want to, is that you need to be able to get it into your hand. And I have a little girl hand because I'm a little girl. So this Fiskar is actually a really nice pruner, and that ratcheting design is really seductive because it opens it up wider and it looks like you can get a bigger bite. But for people who have small hands, it's actually really hard to use those. Those are I have those in my repertoire, and if I'm out with people, the big-handed people get to use that one. All right, pruning saws. So not just any saw really does the job when you're talking about pruning. You don't want to use a bow saw or a crosscut saw. You really want a saw that's designed for cutting woody branches. So arborist saw, these stills I really like. You can have them with a fixed handle or foldable handles, but you do want to make sure that the blade is fairly stiff. This red one up here, it's a nice folder, but the blade itself is kind of flimsy, and it's bent a few times, and now it's really not very useful anymore. And a saw in general, you're going to use that to cut anything from 1 to 6 inches in diameter. Saws are really pretty versatile. I like to have, so this black still saw, folding one, that's one of my go-tos. And then I have the larger one with the fixed handle and a slightly larger blade that I use for taking off bigger branches. Loppers are really nice to have, but again, you know, it's a big tool, so you kind of think, oh, I can take off a big branch, but in reality, you're really only going to be able to take about a 1 to 1.5 inch twig off with a lopper. And again, looking at this red one down here, it's got that ratcheting mechanism, so it opens up really wide. You can get those cutting edges around a big twig, like a 2-inch diameter. But then when you crank down on that thing, you're going to end up usually getting stuck and usually damaging the tool. I used to have 5 of these, and after a few seasons of teaching pruning at the University of Minnesota and football players getting a hold of my ratcheting loppers, they have all been destroyed because they tried to take out too big a limb for what the tool was designed for. The other piece is that, especially if you're restoring an older tree, you're often going to want to be able to get into the canopy. So you're probably better off with something that's got a smaller tip with shorter, smaller handles, so you can get into the canopy and get the pruner positioned in the right place to make a good cut. If you have big trees, you're going to definitely want to have extended pole pruners. You can find, you know, the ones with the rope, you know, they can extend way up there into a big old standard tree. They most of the time come with a blade on the end and this bypass cutter that you pull the cord and it brings the cutting edge up. I find that I either use the one, I usually have two, one that's got a cutting edge, a saw, and one that's got the bypass pruner, because if you're trying to get in there to use the bypass, the blade is in the way. So I always end up taking the blade off. And then down below that, this shorter one, this black one, it's called a Power Stroke. I believe that's a Fiskar brand, but there's probably other ones that are similar. It's about 4 feet long, and it's got, you can kind of see near the tip here, there's a chain. That chain goes down through the handle, and there's a pull down near you at the bottom that you use, so you don't have this long tangled rope that's eternally getting caught on everything. The other thing I really like about the Power Stroke is that it's got a pivoting head. So you can use this orange little doohickey here to turn that head so you can get it at just the right angle, which is really nice if you're trying to get water sprouts that are on top of a limb and you're down below. It's really hard to get that cut up above the branch when you're coming at it from below. So a pivoting head is really nice as a way to get a nice cleaner cut on those water sprouts that you're trying to clean out of a canopy. And always remember to sanitize your tools. I know it seems like a pain, but in the end, in terms of disease control, especially trying to prevent fire blight, it's a good idea to sanitize your tools. All right. And then if you're training young trees, you're going to want to use some kind of spreaders to help get the trained branches where you want them to be. So these metal ones, they look really cool, but I actually don't use them very much. They tend to kind of be a pain in the butt. They don't stick that well in the tree, and when they fall out of the tree, you find them with the mower later. The homemade ones with a wood lath are really actually nice. Wood lath is cheap. You can cut a little V, and then right here where in the red circle, you see there's a little Brad's nail. Drive that in there, and then you cut off the head so there's a nice sharp little point. That point goes into the twig where you're going to put the spreader and holds it in position. And they work really, really well, and they're very inexpensive, and you can make it to the exact length that you want it. And then the training bands, which are cool because they're just like extra stretchy bands. So the training bands are especially useful on young trees where you're really trying to train those lower branches so they're going out almost horizontally. If you look for those online, use the term apple tree training bands. It used to be that you could only buy them in batches of like 5,000, but I think now you can find them in smaller quantities. Another thing is that you don't waste your money, is pruning sealer. So you can still buy it everywhere. There's all kinds of different kinds. But research has shown very clearly that adding a pruning sealer does not, in fact, increase the success of the healing of that wound. In fact, it decreases the success of the healing. It slows down the natural healing process of the tree, and it introduces more rot because it seals moisture in. Whereas if you don't try to seal that, the tree is, it evolved for millions of years to deal with branches breaking off. So it knows how to biologically seal off that cut and then heal it over fairly quickly. So don't waste your money on pruning sealer. Okay. Stefan, how are we doing? No questions yet? Everybody's just sticking with me?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. No questions that I've seen as of yet.
Okay.
But,
yeah. All right. I'm going to keep moving forward here then. Okay.
Cindy, one question is, where can you get some of that equipment? You've listed some of that equipment. Do you have recommendations on where you buy the saws and the tools?
The saws, any place you would buy a chainsaw will probably have those still a good hardware store, you can get any of this stuff pretty easily at a decent hardware store. Yeah, the only thing that's a little trickier to get are the training bands. So, you know, maybe the Finland food chain goes together and buys 5,000 and then people can have them for years to come. So, central leader pruning system. So, really the central leader system is designed for self-supporting trees. So if you're doing trellis trees or espalier, again, that's a totally different system. The open vase is more something you'd use for cherries, plums, and there's all kinds of modifications. But we're going to be focusing really on the central leader. And oh yeah, the graft union, if it's not obvious. So if you're planting a brand new tree, it's really important to be aware of where that graft union is, because above that the graft union is where the variety meets the rootstock. The variety is the part of the tree that produces fruit, and the rootstock is the part that produces the root, and they're genetically completely different. So on this grafted tree on the right-hand side, this little plastic wrap here, that's the graft union, because that's a little whip and tongue graft that I did. And the variety is this long stalk going off to the upper left. And then the one that's got the red circle around it, that's a twig from the rootstock. I always leave that as kind of a backup when I'm grafting in case I need to use it again. But if I were to plant that tree, that's going to come off, because you don't want to be propagating the rootstock into the crown, because it won't produce the fruit that you want it to. Okay, so the first thing you want to do for a central leader, and again, we're starting with we're going to prune a young tree. That's where we're starting right now. So you buy this cool tree, whether it's bare root or in a container, and it has lots of branches. And really that's because that's marketing. People like to buy trees that are really well feathered. That's kind of what it's called. It's when a tree is well feathered. So it has lots of branches. But in reality, when you plant that tree, you're going to cut most of that off, because the tree doesn't have enough root to support that whole canopy to begin with. And in the first year or two, really what you want that tree to be doing is putting down roots. So you're going to minimize the load on it by pruning it down. The first thing is pick that central leader. Typically it is the tallest twig. So the circle here, the one that's in the red circle here, you really could have picked either one of those two. The one on the left is just a titch higher than the other one. So that's what you go with. So then the next step after you've selected your leader is you remove any opposite branches. Opposite branches tend to lead towards weak wood that won't bear fruit that well. And then you're also going to be looking to remove anything that has a sharp V or sharp angles, because again, that makes for really weak wood. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of a diagram of a branch that's at a 45 to 60. You can even go 90. Actually, for the semi-dwarfs, I like close to a 90-degree angle for my scaffold branches. But a narrow angle is going to have this inherent weak compressed wood. And as soon as that branch starts to bear fruit, the weight of that fruit is going to lead to splitting. And so if you're training a young tree from scratch, you really want to avoid those sharp angles. And again, whenever I teach this class face-to-face, I remind people over and over again, you're not pruning this tree because of the way it looks today. You're pruning it in preparation for what it's going to look like when it's mature, which means it's going to be bigger. And so one of the things you want to think about is how are you going to manage the understory of this tree? minimum of so that bottom scaffold should be at least 36 to 40 inches above the ground. If you want to be able to ride your riding lawnmower around the base of that tree, you probably even need to go higher, because that bottom branch, when it's a mature tree, it's going to be big and it's going to stick out quite a ways. And so you need it to be high enough so that you can get under it to do the management of the understory that you need to do. And then when you're selecting the subsequent lateral branches on this diagram, it's branches A, B, and C. You want those branches, when you're selecting them on the young tree, to be at least 8 to 10 inches between each other along the main stem. And why do you, why? You know, okay, well, you know, many people think that trees, the distance between A and B on that stem, it will never grow any more than that. The only vertical growth that occurs on a tree is via the central leader, that leading growth. You'll get some lateral growth, but the distance between A and B is fixed. It's never going to get wider. But what will happen is the branch A and branch B are going to get wider in diameter. So now, you know, 10 years from now, branch A is 6 or 8 inches in diameter. Branch B is 6 or 8 inches in diameter. Now you can see how a big branch here and a big branch here, they started out as little branches, which seemed like far ways apart, but now as they got big, it got mature, they're closing that gap. But they're still far enough distant that they're forming nice, strong junctions. The other piece is that you want these branches, as they're going up the tree, to be spiraling through three-dimensional space. That's the other problem with printed versions of pruning manuals, is everything's in two-dimensional, but we live in a three-dimensional world. And you want these branches, A, B, and C, to kind of be spinning around that trunk as they're growing, because then each of those laterals will have plenty of space to spread out sideways. They're not stacked one on top of each other. When you stack branches on top of each other, they end up interfering with each other, they shade each other out, and it creates lots of problems. Okay. So this is
A few questions.
Yeah.
Did you want to tackle them now, or?
Sure, you can hop in.
Okay. So one was just wondering, how late into the spring can you prune in Minnesota?
Oh, good question. Yeah, basically when the maple syrup starts to flow, I would stop pruning. Because that means the trees are starting to break dormancy. So I do know people who have pruned well into May. So for all, you can talk to 10 different orchardists and get 10 different correct answers. I usually wait till February to do my pruning, because I want to get through that cold snap that usually always comes in January. If I prune, you technically could prune in December or even late November. Once the leaves are gone and the tree is in fully dormant state, you could prune then, but a freshly pruned cut is more susceptible to winter damage. So that's why I tend to wait till after that January cold snap. So figure out when that last cold snap is going to be and prune after that. So I tend to do my pruning in February, and then I stop when the maple syrup starts to flow.
Okay, and another question is, how far from juniper and red cedar trees to avoid apple cedar rust in terms of planting? You have any thoughts on that?
So that's a whole nother, that's the pest management and IPM question. So the short answer is, if you pick a variety that's resistant to cedar rust, then you're not going to have a problem. You can plant it under a cedar tree. So that's more of a varietal selection. If you have a variety that is susceptible to cedar rust and you have cedar trees, then you're going to need to use some kind of a fungicide like a sulfur spray to manage that. So that's an IPM question, and we'll do an IPM workshop like in May or June, when we can, answer a lot of those management questions. Yeah.
And let's see, and how much can you prune it, like an apple tree, for instance, in 1 year? 5
Oh.
of the up to 1 inch branches, 10? How many generally can you take off?
So the rule of thumb, and this will come on another slide, the rule of thumb is never take more than 1/3 of the volume of the tree. You know what? I'm going to jump forward here, because some of these questions are, okay. So you've got a tree. Nobody has a tree that looks like this, right? It was planted and then you forgot about it. Now it's like 5 or 6 years old and you're like, oh, now what do I got to do? So the rule of thumb is never to remove more than 1/3 of the tree. And the reason for that is all back to hormones. The more wood you remove, the stronger the hormonal response to that pruning there will be. And so sometimes less is more in terms of how to clean up a tree that's been neglected. Again, you never want to remove that central leader. The next thing would be to remove any opposite branches. And then the next thing would be to look into where those branches are. Anything that's going in towards the canopy or crossing, those are the things you're going to want to remove. And when I say hormonal response, most of the time what that means is water sprouts. Water sprouts are these very vertical branches that grow in response to a tree being injured. And what happens, it's all about hormones again. The tree was injured, some wood was removed, whether it was bear or lightning strike or you pruning it or wind damage or snow damage. And so all of a sudden the auxins, there's not as many auxins, the cytokines are saying, go, be free, grow, and you get water sprouts. So it's a natural response of the tree to kind of rebuild it. And so what you're gonna get this when you prune, and then the thing you have to be, and that's why I say, if you're not prepared to commit 3 to 5 years to restore this tree, you're better off not starting. Because if you go in and you remove some branches, you're going to get some of this water sprouting. And then in the subsequent growing season, this is the one exception to don't remove live tissue during the growing season. The one exception to that rule is water sprouts. So after you prune, you're going to get this hormonal response. You're going to get a lot of, depending on how much you remove, the more you remove, the more sprouting you're going to get. So during the subsequent growing season, you can go in and just watch. It's a good thing, practice. Walk through your orchard once a week or once every 2 weeks or at least once a month and watch for that new growth in undesirable places. So anything that's growing straight up or in, and you can remove those new sprouts during the growing season. And if you stay on top of that throughout the growing season, you'll have calmed down that hormonal response a little bit. That makes sense? Should I zing?
Perfect sense.
Should I zing back? I'm going to zing back. Where was I? Okay, here we go. So this is an example of one example in one of many books I have about how to prune, and I completely and wholeheartedly disagree. So I have just a few simple rules that I follow when I prune my trees. One is that I leave outward growing branches so that the more horizontal they are, the more likely they're going to stay based on my decisions to remove or leave them. And anything that's growing up, I remove. So in the picture where you can see those couple of branches that are growing up, I'll take those off every year. Every year I take them off. Even if it's a fruiting spur, I'm going to take it off, because anything that's growing up or in the long run is going to probably cause you more pain and anxiety than not. Leave all of the horizontal twigs and the downward twigs. So on this second year tree, you see oh, there we go. On this second year branch where the red circle is, they just took off this one little sprout. You can see this kind of gray. And they left these the two that have the X's on them. And you see what happened in year 3 is those 2 upward growing branches produced more twigs, and now they're starting to encroach upon the lateral branch that's above it. Well, that's not good. So I would have taken those 2 branches out right away and encouraged the horizontal growth as opposed to any upward growth. Horizontal branching is what hormonally, again, tells the tree that it's ready to start producing fruit. Fruit is produced on horizontal branches. And again, I'm going to remove any upward growth, and that will encourage, because on those little twigs that are growing up, what am I removing? Everybody in unison is saying, auxins. Yes, very good. And so that little branch where I took out those upward growing branches, there's going to be dormant buds that sprout that then next season I'm going to get to choose from which ones I want to keep, which ones I want to get rid of. And I'm going to be pruning, so I'm kind of getting this horizontal fan shape that's going to support my fruit without growing up. I hope that's making a little sense. Another thing is that this I don't know who wrote this book. They left these 3 branches in the second year. There's 3 lateral branches that are very close together, and they left them all, and I'm not sure why. And you see on the third year, that cluster, all of a sudden you have 3 lateral branches that are basically on top of each other. So I would not have left those. I would have only left 1 lateral branch in that cluster. And the way I would have decided which of those 3 I would keep was looking at the spiral nature of how those branches are distributed in the 3-dimensional space of your tree. Of those 3, I would select the one that is heading into the openest space. So when you're looking at the 3-dimensional space, that will be the canopy of your tree, you're going to select the one that's going into the most open space. I hope that makes sense. All right, so here's an example of one of my trees that I pruned long ago. And, you know, the bottom 2 branches, you know, probably could have done better, blah, blah, blah. But training a young tree is a really, really valuable thing to do. It's going to save you a lot of heartache later. This one I'm using one of those metal limb spreaders. So just so you kind of keep it in your head, limb spreaders basically are pushing the branch down, and you're using a force between the main stem and the branch to push it down. And yeah, and you really you generally train a branch in its first or second year, maybe 3 years. By 4 years, those branches are stiff enough that if you try to move their location, you try to bend them in relation to the main stem, they're probably gonna break. So you really want to do this training when the branches are quite young. Here's an example.
Cindy,
yes.
Going back to that picture, I know you had talked about the branches, when you trim them, you want them 8 to 10 inches.
Yeah,
like
so I
distance.
failed on this one, didn't I?
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if there was a different thinking.
Good call. Yeah, this is a tree I pruned back when I was a baby. Yeah, no, these branches, these horizontal branches are way too close to each other. You're right. And in fact, so that those bottom ones, one of those 2 should have gone, and probably the next one up should have gone. The next one up is going away from the picture, so out into open space. And then, you know, that other one that's 3 up. Yeah, so yeah, good call. Those are too close together. Okay, so this is an example of a pear tree. I'm kind of using these descriptions as pears and apples synonymous, but pears do have some idiosyncratic growth behaviors that can be challenging. Pears are notorious for wanting to grow up. They just want their branches to grow up, up, up. And so training pear branches when the pear tree is very young to be as horizontal as possible is a really good idea. Stay on top of it. As soon as you spread that branch horizontal on a pear, the next season, it's going to send a little vertical shoot up. And then what are you going to do with that vertical shoot? You're going to cut it off. And it feels ruthless. I get it. You know, you really want to cut all those little branchlets off. But remember, in the first 5 years of that tree's life, you're building the physical architecture, the structure upon which, built out of wood, will hold all the smaller branches and the fruit spurs that produce your fruit. So don't get too ahead of yourself. In those first 3 to 5 years, you're really building that wood architecture, and then the tree starts to produce fruit.
So Cindy, someone wants to know if you could hang weights on the branches.
Oh, you guys, you're way ahead of me. I'm not going fast enough. Hang on to that. I'm going to come back to that. So this is just an example of those training bands. I really like them. To be honest, they're my favorite thing for training young trees. They're super stretchy. So you literally, just like you would take a rubber band and wrap it around your finger and stretch it out. They're so stretchy, you wrap it around the main stem of the tree and you stretch that thing out, and you can get that supple limb, and you put it down into the loop, and then you adjust it so that that limb is just in exactly the right place that you want it to be. And they last about a year, year and a half. Just long enough for the limb to fix in that position, and then they fall off. They just, degrade from UV. And many people ask me, doesn't that pinch the flow of food and water in the main stem of the tree? No, it doesn't appear to have any negative effect on the tree, the fact that that band is wrapped around the main stem. So they're really great. And then notice on this slide, it says weights don't work. So isn't that pretty? But they're really not doing much in terms of training the branches. I mean, they're not doing much. So this one, here's an example. They put water pop bottles around, and it looks like it's training them down, but look at the main stem of that tree. And when you get to that bottom branch, that's still a really sharp angle. It's a very tight V angle. So while it kind of looks like they trained that branch out horizontally, all they did was pull the leader down. They really aren't changing the architecture of that limb. Plus, as soon as there's a wind gust that comes through here, it's going to rip those off. I've tried all kinds of weights. I've tried heavy rocks. I've tried multiple gallon jugs of water. And it is amazing how much weight the wind just picks them up. You can use cinder block. For the most part, I have not had cinder block move. But, if you put it, anyway. So the short version is I've tried all kinds of weights. I've never found any that I found satisfactory. More often than not, they cause more mechanical damage to the tree when it's windy than any training function. I find that the spreaders and the bands do a much better job. So, but you can try it, see if you like it. Another way to train those branches without any kind of spreaders or anything is just to use strategic cuts. So what's called a heading cut. If you want this branch, so that branch with the little red arrow, if I want that branch to grow in the direction of that red arrow, I'm going to look for a bud that is facing the direction that I want that branch to grow, and I'm going to cut right above it. And so what happened there? What did I do? I cut that top twig off, and I removed the auxin producing part of that branch. So then what happens? Those lower buds sprout. And so all of a sudden, where I had just a single branch, now in the next growing season, I cut it off in the winter. The next growing season, those buds are released and they start to grow. And if you're on it right away in the right away in the spring, so what I'm going for is I'm trying to get that outermost branch that's going to grow out in the direction I want it to. I want to support that. I want to leave that one and remove the other ones. So you can go in the growing season and remove the green sprouts that are going up or out or in a different direction that you want. As soon as they burst, as soon as you see little green, you can just rub them off with your thumb. And you don't even have to worry about pruning them next year. If you end up letting them go, then in the following winter, you would leave that outermost branch and prune off the ones that are growing up or in. And if you do that repeatedly, you're going to get this cool outward growing branch. Can you visualize that? People kind of visualizing that? Maybe, kind of, almost. So you've done a great job training your young tree. So now you're in maintenance pruning, which is really pretty minimal and pretty easy. The key goals for maintenance pruning is to keep the canopy open so that you have some really good airflow and really good light penetration. Both airflow and light penetration are going to end up decreasing your disease to fungus and bacteria and increase the maturation of your fruit. Because if the fruit is hidden in this shady, dark, cool canopy, it's just not maturing as quickly as if it was in a bright, sunny canopy. And especially in northern Minnesota, as you all know, we have short growing seasons. So the more sun that can get inside that canopy, the faster your fruit is going to mature and ripen. And then you're just going to keep your eyes peeled for removing any troublesome branches or vertical growth. And again, the height of the tree is determined by the rootstock. So once that tree reaches its kind of genetically predisposed size, it's going to just kind of top off and stop putting on lots of tip growth. And in general, once a tree is over about 5 years old or 6 years old and it starts bearing fruit, you don't want to see a lot of tip growth. On average, good tip growth for a producing tree is 1 to 4 inches. So if you've got a tree that is 7 years old and it's still putting on 8-10 inch tip growth, and it hasn't produced fruit, it's either being over fertilized. People ask me this a lot too. I don't fertilize my trees. I don't. Beyond just grazing them with my sheep. Fertilization tends to promote wood growth, not fruit development. You're better, unless you're in like a super sandy soil that is really, really deplete of nutrients, you're better off not fertilizing, because fertilizing generally leads to luxurious wood growth and not increased fruit production. I know some people won't like that answer, but there it is. So maintenance pruning, another thing to be really aware of is the difference between a fruit spur and a vegetative bud. I gave my brother some apple trees, and one year he called me and told me he was so proud of himself because he had pruned it all by his big self, and he had removed all those little nubs. And I'm like, you just removed all the fruit from your entire tree. And he's like, what? No way. Yes. So these little nubs that look really wrinkly and have these little stripes on them, those are the fruit spurs. The fruit spur, when that bursts open, that's going to have your flowers, and that's going to be where your fruit develops. And they have each of the little lines that you see in this fruit spur is 1 year of annual growth. So a fruit spur is putting on just a few layers of cells each year, just enough to lay down, enough to put in to produce those blossoms, the fruit, and then to lay down another row of buds for the next year. And so that fruit spur is at least 5 to 6 years old. They don't grow very much. When you prune a tree, it's not uncommon, especially if it's an older tree that is producing, it's not uncommon that a fruiting spur will go back into its vegetative state and start to produce a little twig. And that's just something, again, that you manage as you're pruning it. They can flip back and forth between their vegetative state and their fruit-bearing state. I hope I didn't lose anybody there. So look at that tree. That is an immaculately pruned tree. You can see airspace through the canopy, so you know there's plenty of light and plenty of air. Those big branches, you know, those big branches are 8 or so inches in diameter, and they were far enough apart when they were originally created that even though they got bigger, they're still offset. That's a nice looking tree. That's not one of my trees. I wish I had a tree that looked that nice. Okay, and then
So Cindy, we're at about 12 minutes left.
Okay.
And
So you want to restore an old tree. The first thing to do is to remove the water sprouts or any of the sprouts that are on a tree. Sometimes the best thing to do in the first year is just to remove water sprouts and thin the canopy, and don't remove any large limbs. Another thing to consider when you're the rules when you're restoring a neglected tree are different than when you're training a young tree. So you see this circle here on this tree? There's a really strong V there. So there's a tendency, Cindy said, not to leave any strong V crotches. Yes, that's true on a young tree. But if you were to take out one of those 2 branches, you're probably never going to recover that tree. It just will never heal. And so you have to, when you're restoring an old tree, you have to deal with the structure that's there. And sometimes it's got some undesirable features. So thinning the first year or 2, as opposed to removing any big branches, might be your best choice. See how it responds. So another thing, okay. So here's an example, kind of a little summary on what to remove, what to leave.
oh my.
Yeah. So what are you going to do with that one? Anybody got suggestions?
Cut it down.
So sometimes that is the right answer. Sometimes if it's just too big of a mess and it's never going to do what you want it to do, you cut it down and you plant a new one.
So Cindy, there are some questions related to the fruit nub becoming vegetative. One question is, do you trim it when it's become vegetative? Also, will it go back to fruiting nub after it's come vegetation? There was just some clarification.
Yeah. So when a fruiting spur converts to a vegetative spur, if it starts to grow in a direction you don't want it to grow, like it's growing up or it's growing into another branch, then you're going to prune it off. But if it's growing horizontally into more or less open space, you can let it go. And if it's more or less horizontal, what will eventually happen is that twig will start to produce new fruiting spurs. Does that make sense? Kind of almost.
Yep. So what are we going to do with that tree? Let's hear it.
Yeah. So people can type into the chat or Q&A. What are you going to do with that tree? So if this tree is a super amazing antique variety that you just don't want to live without, you can so there's a couple of ways to go. So if it's a really high value variety that you want to keep, you can whack it back, and what's it going to do? It's going to produce lots of water sprouts. Water sprouts are great scions for grafting. So then you can propagate that tree on new rootstock. You can put it on semi-dwarf, you can put it on high density, and in 5 to 7 years, you're going to have a brand new, well-sculptured tree producing that variety. And now that I'm older, I tend to go in that direction. But I do have some older trees that came with my homestead that we just continually, on an annual basis, we just thin the canopy. I'm not going to try to remove any big branches out of this tree. I'm just going to remove all the dead wood, stand back. Just removing the dead wood can sometimes make it look a whole lot better. And then thin that canopy. And if you do that for a few years, it's never going to be perfect, but it'll start producing higher quality, larger fruit. The more well pruned a tree is, the larger the fruit it's going to produce, and the more evenly mature fruit it's going to produce. So, depends on how emotionally attached you are to that tree. There is no right or wrong answer. Other questions? There's got to be other questions.
There's none right now.
What? Couldn't have been that good.
Left. We've got 3 minutes.
So what would so I would love to hear what people want to see in future Apple webinars. Integrated pest management, summer management.
There's a question about a tree wound. Do you want to address that?
Yeah. Shoot.
It says the bark peeled off. How can that be protected to safeguard the tree?
So you cut a limb off and it stripped down. So that's why I kind of skipped through here, but that's why when you're removing a limb, you want to do it in 3 cuts. You do an undercut, which is number 1, so that that branch doesn't pull down and strip the bark. Number 2 takes off the weight of the branch. And then number 3, you're doing the final cut right above the collar, so it'll heal over. So there's really the unfortunate truth is if you had a big piece of bark peel off, and I don't know how it got peeled off, it was mechanical injury or a bear or whatever, there's really not much you can do. We as humans tend to want to be interventionists, but there's not a whole lot we can do that the tree hasn't already figured out. It knows how to internally kind of heal off a wound so that it minimizes the amount of infection. And even if it's a big wound and it never really fully heals, these old apple trees, I have an old apple tree that's over 100 years old and has been hollow for the last 30, and it produces just fine. So I know that's an unsatisfactory answer, that there really isn't much you can do about the peeled bark, but I would recommend that you not use a prune sealer on it, because that will make it worse. It'll trap moisture and it'd be more likely to get black rot than if you don't do anything.
There's another 2 questions quick. We're pretty much out of time. Julie asks, what is your system for sanitizing tools? And my additional question is, do you do it after each tree or after a series? And then another one probably goes back to that old tree not producing. How do you get it to produce? And maybe some of those techniques you've mentioned is one way to get it to produce.
Yeah, so sanitizing, if you don't know the history of your orchard, then sanitize. I just carry a squirt bottle of isopropyl alcohol into the field with me, into the orchard with me, and I'm squirting it down all the time. And definitely when you're done at the end of the day, sanitize your tools, dry them off before you put them away so they don't rust. In terms of getting an old tree, I assume this old tree used to produce and now it's not producing anymore. The best approach for that is to just get in there and thin that canopy. Thin. Try to get more light and more air into that canopy, and hopefully it will start producing again. again, you know, you really, if you want to bring an old tree back into production, you really do need to commit 3 to 5 years to that process. But if you stay on it, the results are really awesome. A full standard tree can produce 1,000 pounds of apples. So it's not easy to manage that, but it can produce a lot if you put a little effort into it.
There are more questions and great ideas for topics, but we are past the time already.
If people need to peel off, they can. If people, I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes and answer some more questions if people would like that.
Okay, well, it looks like, let's see, where are we at here? So if you removed more than a third, do you kill the tree, or is it?
There's no right, you stress it. It's very stressful to have that much canopy removed. And so that you really, you might kill it. It depends on the variety. It depends on how stressed the tree was to begin with. If it was very stressed to begin with, removing more than a third might kill it. But if you remove, even if it's a relatively healthy tree, if you remove more than a third, you're going to get just an extreme hormonal response. And then you're going to spend the next 3 years, 4 years, just managing that hormonal response before you can really continue. So that's why I say the first year that you attack an older tree, you're better off not removing any big limbs, but just clearing that canopy out. See how the tree responds. When you do a canopy clearing, does that particular tree, because every variety is going to respond a little differently to pruning. So do a canopy clearing prune and see how the tree responds. If you do a canopy clearing prune and you don't get a whole crap ton of water sprouts, then you know you can push that tree a little bit more. If you do a canopy thin and you get just this riot of water sprouts, well, then you know you got to go really slow. So there's no, so it depends. It depends on the variety, depends on the specific of that tree. It depends on how stressed that tree is. But yeah, in general, if you take off more than a third, you're going to have a huge hormonal disruption.
Okay. I think that's, unless I'm missing something, I think that's all of our questions.
Great job.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy.
Lots of
That
good
was
responses.
amazing.
Well, I
Thank you.
hope it was helpful. And I think the take home message for everybody is just go out and do something and then bond with your tree. Go back and visit your tree in the spring and watch where it sprouts, what it's looking like. Take this opportunity to do a little bonding with your tree.
Okay, lots and lots of thank yous. People seem with lots of exclamation points.
Oh, good.
And yep, Bob is going to go bond with his tree.
Yay!
Well, no, that was wonderful. A lot to take in, and as you said, I think it's just you just go out there and you start.
Yeah.
Okay, looks like people are peeling off, so I think we'll just say thank you, everybody. Stay warm and have a good Friday evening and a great weekend.
All right.
Thank you, Cindy.
Oh, my pleasure.